Today we're working with emotional flashbacks. So this is something that I've learned a lot about from Pete Walker. And he has a lot of information and resources around this on his website. His books, it's pete-walker.com. Two of his books that I find are especially helpful, The Tao of Fully Feeling and Complex PTSD. And you don't have to read his books necessarily. There's also a page of resources that you can also tap into. The things that he brings to understanding trauma and our nervous system and how this works, I had never seen anybody with such a complete understanding of it in a way, even though the book Complex PTSD is very thick, it's not hard to read in the sense of it's not hard to understand. He's been a therapist for many decades and has a very grounded, compassionate approach to working with complex trauma. So I've just added a few of his reparenting affirmations here. I love who you are, and I'm always doing my best to be on your side, things like that. He's very much helping us to be more on our own side, to recognize what's going on and to be on our own side. I love that about his work. So I'm not going to kind of go through today what happens if you're having an emotional flashback. There are some things that he's written about it. You can download his 13 steps. You can have it somewhere handy for yourself. And also I have a guided practice that if you get these on a PDF format, you can click there, or you can search emotional flashback on my YouTube channel and you'll have a guided practice. It's really helpful to have this list in front of you and to do some kind of a practice of acknowledging this is what's happening. I'm having a flashback. I feel afraid, but I'm not in danger. Those first two steps would really be helpful when we're in the midst of that. The first thing that we have to do is know that this is what's happening and that actually we're not in any danger right now. And then we can come to the rest of the steps. We can come back into our body. We can remind ourselves that we're in an adult body now. We have resources we didn't have before. The other ones are longer term ones, and those are some resources for when we're actually in the middle of a flashback. So we recognize that it's happening. We say to ourselves, I feel afraid, but I know I'm not in danger. And we have to look around the room and observe that with our own eyes. There's all of those grounding and orienting practices, many of which are on my YouTube channel that we can use for that. So these are the 13 steps he suggests that we work with. And so we're going to work with some of those steps today. Here is where we're going to pause for our inquiry and to work with these when we're not in the midst of an emotional flashback. So if you are right at this moment, it would be good to step back and maybe pause. If you're listening to this, especially later, you could stop and listen to the guided practice that I have included. You could look at his steps, download those steps and have a look at them and work with the steps. So right now, when we're feeling safe, when we're not in an emotional flashback right now, these are some of the things that we could do. And so I'm going to go through them kind of slowly for anyone who doesn't want to be watching them on the screen. And then if there's one or two of those that you really want to work with right now, we're going to do an inquiry for, 5-7 minutes, something like that. You could do that. You could just kind of put me on mute and really hone in on one. But if you want, you could just close your eyes and see what comes up when you hear the words. So to start with, just to notice, how often do you feel like you experience emotional flashbacks? How often do you experience that in the morning, certain time of day? Someone said, she often feels that around 4 or 5 o'clock when her father would get home from work. She wasn't too sure if he would get home safe or not safe on any particular day. Other people wake up just that feeling of generalized anxiety or dread. And, when you look at your whole day, it's clear there's nothing particular wrong. You're not dreading anything in particular that's happening, but yet you wake up with that feeling of, I'm not sure I'm going to be okay today. So those are an emotional experience that we had probably many times when we were a child. And so it makes sense that we're associating it with the time of day or with a particular trigger, as we call them. Let's go through some of these steps. The one thing is to print out the 13 steps off of Pete's website and have them visible for yourself. They're handy. You could have them, you could save them onto your phone. You could also have them printed out and tack them up a few times. One of the hardest things for people is to recognize actually, this is what's happening right now. And this is where our long term mindfulness practice really comes in. When we're aware of our usual circumstance in our bodies, if we have a fairly relaxed shoulders, we're not usually clenching our teeth, and then we notice that that's changed, then that's a signal, oh, there's something going on. I need to pause. Same with if your breath has gotten to be more smooth and even and continuous, and then you notice you're holding your breath. The way our nervous system works is it makes sense. So it might not make sense on a kind of a level of there's danger or not danger right now, but it makes sense in terms of our history. So to have a way to notice when something changes in your body, your energy, breath, could be thoughts in your mind, certain kinds of thinking come in, that would be a signal. Next week, we're going to work with the inner critic. That's a big signal that there's an emotional flashback happening. If you could just pause for a moment and bring to mind what are the times when you are more likely to experience an emotional flashback? And what are the signals? Do you hold your breath? Do you clench your teeth? What are the signals that you could really pay attention to that would let you know when you're starting to go into that emotional flashback? And you could make a note mentally or jot them down and we regulate around that. So if we're holding our breath, we could do some breath practices. If we're holding our breath and we notice that, then we could take some long exhales, take some deeper breaths. If we're breathing kind of shallow, we could do box breathing or the double inhale, long exhale. So once we have a few go-tos, we have some tools around this. As soon as we notice what's happening, then we could go right into the regulating our nervous system. If it's compulsive thinking, tapping really helps. Putting the picture in a frame, taking your eyes around the outside space. All of those practices are at our fingertips once we learn them. So that could be something when you're not in an emotional flashback. Those are some things that you could do is learn those tools. Inner critic inquiry. So the inner critic, when we start feeling that kind of tension or we start getting those words in our mind like, oh, I'm so stupid, or sometimes it's more, you're so stupid. When we start to get those kinds of thoughts in our mind, or we get into a perfectionist thing or something like that, then it's a good time to stop and pay specific attention to the inner critic. And we're going to work more with that next week. But always, it's good to know who's talking in my head. What's the tone of voice? And is it helpful? Is it something that it would be good to continue on with? Is it something that would be good to put a stop to? So the inner critic is a big piece. So just to notice how that lands for you. And often underlying the fear or anger is grief. What are you grieving that you lost because of your childhood trauma? And is this something that resonates with you? Do you feel like, oh, yeah, I think there is a lot of grief. There's a big pool of grief. When I actually feel anxious or afraid, and I can go into feeling the feelings of that, then that usually releases things a bit. It helps. Notice what your relationship is around that. And the thing about developmental trauma in general is that it sets our brain and our nervous system up in a certain pattern. And then through the rest of our life, until we do something to heal that, it affects us. Notice what comes up for you around that. My grief of what I lost because of childhood trauma. Notice your breath, your body. And one of the things that we can do that's related to that is what are the triggers that put us into a flashback? So if we had a lot of danger and feelings of being unsafe, there was a loud voice, there was yelling, there was addiction or violence, then that's going to trigger us or make us feel a similar way as an adult as well. It can help us look at this from a complete picture. What generally puts me back into a flashback state of feeling anxious and afraid? And what specifically is it certain people? Is it certain events? Is it a certain type of energy? that kind of chaotic energy. So, if you were to have a little list in your mind of some of the triggers, then you could work with staying away from them. Sometimes we can't stay away from it completely, but maybe you could get yourself some support. Having some good noise canceling headphones or earplugs now is very helpful. So, when we inquire into it, we might notice first what are the triggers, and then we can notice and do some longer term personal work around healing those wounds. Do you feel like you're on your own side? Do you feel like you understand the basic process? And what is it that could help with being more compassionate with yourself? So these are all this big loop. We have this feeling of hopelessness sometimes. We kind of predict that our adult life is going to be the same as our childhood, even though we know in our conscious mind that's not true. So, one of the things that we can do is to really look at what is my life like right now in terms of support? Who is around me that is safe for me to be around? Who do I feel safe with? Who can I relax with? And none of that is perfect, of course, but just generally speaking, how could I cultivate more safety? And being part of a group like this is one of the ways that we do that. We can come to a place, learn more about ourselves, share that with other people. We have a high level of predictability here that we're not going to be shamed for how we feel. That's one of the things that we can cultivate online as well as in our personal life. So who is it that's really safe for you to be around? Who do you need to move away from? Who could you move closer to, including the relationship that you have with yourself? And then notice your body, your breath. Open your eyes and look around and notice cues of safety. Move your body a bit. And then when you're ready, coming out of the inquiry, come back to the group.